mon ami? Okay. Is this recording? Yes, it is. Now, just because I'm on summer vacation, it does not mean I can afford to let myself be lazy with recording this time. So, why don't... It's time for us to finish this chapter off, shall we? Figaro, 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 Figaro. Sorry, I was just trying to warm up my vocalizing. I should probably do that before I record these things. I've got to remember the lessons that TC taught me. Anyone who is curious about TC, it's Top Cat. Moving on. He didn't know when the hole had opened up inside him. It hadn't been when his mother died. She'd always been a frail woman, gaunt-faced with hair like his, her body always slightly bent, as if weighed down by the judgments of the society that had left the two of them to face it alone. She'd worked constantly, and slept when she could, so he'd done his best to stay out of her way. But one day her bedroom door had stayed shut several hours past lunchtime, and when his stomach had started to growl, he'd carefully opened the door and peeked in. There she'd been, hanging from the ceiling fan, her hair a funeral veil over her face, barren varicosed feet dangling over the nicotine-stained carpet. He called the police because that was what she told him to do if anything ever happened to her. When the cops had arrived at their cramped and dingy apartment, they'd found him kneeling on her bedroom floor, face solemn, eyes dry, looking up at her expectantly as if any moment now she would brush the hair away from her eyes and ask him what he wanted to eat. It hadn't been at the foster homes. Shuffled from one institution to the next, one sullen and anonymous face among dozens. Society's leftovers, tedious distractions, raised out of obligation until they could be shoved onto the streets without complaint or controversy and die somewhere out of sight. He'd always been pragmatic. Somewhere in his bones, he knew from the start that no one would ever take him in. He'd silently begged for attention as he practiced the art of turning invisible, slipping through the days with the other lost boys, making so little impression on the world that he could scarcely be said to exist at all. He'd taken his meals and cleaned his room and always stared unblinking at the caregivers' faces, waiting for the times when, just for a moment, their eyes would meet his own. It hadn't been the murders. By the time he'd met those three strange figures in that dusty-smelling blue panopticon with its endless water-glass wine in the air, "You are a slave. Want emancipation?" He'd gained an inkling of what was wrong with him, some crucial component omitted in his manufacture. He thirsted for any kind of recognition, for someone to settle their gaze on him, or say his name, and yet it all passed through him without leaving any sort of mark. It all fell through the hole. His own emotions were like stage props, superficially appealing. Whenever he'd been alone, he'd practiced how to smile, but flat on close inspection, and apt to fall over at the least prodding. When those unearthly wardens had made their offer to him, he decided what role he should play. A single bullet fired into the heart of a villain named Masayoshi Shido. He would build that man up to be a linchpin of his cruel society, and then collapse it around his ears. He would bathe in admiration. He would quietly disappear into the night. He would be arrested by the police as he laughed wildly and bashed in that hairless head with a paperweight until it was nothing but bone jelly. He didn't know what he wanted. He didn't know. One or the other. Savior or destroyer, hero or villain, heads or tails, black or white. He turned the coin of his life over and over in his fingers and saw no difference in the sides. He'd warmed his way into Shido's affections, but still the hole was there. His falsified stardom, the great and fraudulent charismatic, earned him more adoration than he thought possible. But still, none of it touched him. He laughed and sneered at the people he killed like some cheap stage villain, but his contempt still felt like role-playing. One more thing that he did just because it was expected of him. He decided to be arrogant. He chose to believe he was better than human just because he was less. And all the while, the hole grew and grew, until there seemed to be nothing left of him but the hole. And at the most fatal moment, his judgment had failed him. When he'd met those assembled and ridiculous phantom thieves, he'd falsified his emotions like always, fixated on his goal, waiting for the moment where he would unravel their pretensions of justice. He hadn't realized until it was too late that those emotions had possessed a subtle curve to them. His laughter, his exasperation, his anger, his paranoia, all of it somehow more resonant, now that he was among people who, foolishly, believed himself to be his equals. When he'd learned that they had slipped out of his grip, laughing all the while, he'd compared their resourcefulness to his own, the course their lives had taken compared to his own. And then, just for a moment, he'd at last seen it fully. That yawning emptiness inside him. That bottomless pit seething with poisonous contradictions. And still they had pitied him. Still, they wouldn't hate him as they should have. So he called forth the madness-inducing monster within himself and used it to cut the cord of his own mind, just so he could blind himself to that void. But even then, as he'd faced down the phantom thief shrieking and insane, the hollow echoes inside him had persisted. The thoughts he'd suffered all his life, no matter how he tried to deafen himself to them. Look at me, but don't come near me. Why won't she reach out to me? I'm better than all of you. I'm the lowest of the low. There's something wrong with me. It's not me. It's the world that's wrong. The only thing that matters is myself. There's no point to me or anything else. I'm strong enough to make it on my own. I don't know how long I can go on. I'm the hero of this story. I'll strike all you would-be heroes down. I'll take my life into my own hands. Help me. I don't need any of you people. Help me. I'll kill you all as soon as I get the chance. Help me. Help me. Oh God, please help me. He awoke. Bright morning sunlight streamed in through the attic window. Dust motes danced like fairies in that beam. He'd slept sitting up, and for a moment it felt like someone had filled all the hollows of his bones with lead. It felt like far too much trouble to move. He just opened his eyes and blinked, until his vision focused, ready to fall back asleep. Then he saw that he wasn't alone, and his breath froze in his throat. Sojiro Sakura had taken Akira's desk chair and dragged it over to the couch. He sat across from Akechi, close enough so that Akechi could reach over and lay his hand on Sojiro's knee. His head was down, his expression inscrutable. He was wearing an apron and a pair of plain white cotton gloves, the kind he might use to clean the cafe. In those gloved hands, he held Akechi's pistol. He appeared fascinated by it. He turned it over and over like an archaeologist presented with an exotic bone. Akechi glanced over to his briefcase. It was wide open, his jacket and tie neatly folded beside it. With great care, Sojiro pulled back the pistol slide. The bullet nestled in the chamber winked in that dusty light. Of course, he'd loaded the gun just before he'd set off to kill Akira and the others. Sojiro's eyes met his. The pistol slide snapped back into place. "Good morning, detective," he said. Sojiro is going to literally wreck Akechi's shit with heat. Oh my goodness, this is gonna suck.